Hello, everyone, and welcome to the breakout session number 3. And it's about civic leadership. It is my great honor to be part of this conference as well with you together. My name is Fatima, and together with my colleague, Werner, I will be the, let's say, the helper of this session with our speakers. I'm part of the PeaceJam program and the European Youth Team, member of the European Youth Team. And we've been organizing and working on many different conferences, and hopefully this one will be as well good and positive as all others. In the upcoming 45 minutes, we will have a lively and really interesting discussion into the role of civil leadership and civil organizations in the delivery of sustainable developmental goals. For that, I would like to introduce our very first interesting key speakers, Tine Moor, Professor of Social Enterprise and Institutions for Collective Action at the Rotterdam School of Management. Hello, Tine. And Werner Schouten, Chair of the Youth Climate Movement and student of Global Business and Sustainability of Rotterdam School of Management. Welcome, dear professors. Both of our speakers have their own perspective on how civic leadership can be used to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, and they complement each other beautifully. Next, I give the word to my fellow European Youth Team member, Werner, and co-facilitator. He will explain now in more detail how this breakout session and our discussion will play out. Werner.
Thank you very much, Fatima, and welcome, of course, our dear guests. I'm Benoit, and just like Fatima mentioned, I'm also part of the European Youth Team, that is a sister organization of PeaceJam that you've heard about before, I assume, if you were part of the previous session. For today's sessions, we'll be hearing from two expert speakers, not in the conventional way that most of you might be used to. Most conferences have somebody like speaking for 45 minutes, and then they try to end it with like 10 minutes of Q&A. In this breakout session, we will try to reverse that. So we'll have our speakers present very short, very brief, their points on civic leadership, and then we'll spend the majority of the time on Q&A, a discussion. If you have questions, please ask them in the chat or in the Q&A section of the platform. I will now throw it back to Fatima, who will introduce our first speaker.
Of course. I will give actually floor now to the Werner, Professor Werner. He is the chair of the Young Climate Movement. And at the beginning, he will give us a short introduction about himself and a lightning talk, and you can already start asking your questions in the chat as our session progresses, as we would like to keep this session really interactive and would like to invite you to propose your questions, your ideas, and if you are not able to share your screen, Professor, please also edit in our question section if anything happens so we can solve it. And the floor is all yours, Professor.
Thanks so much. Calling me professor is too much honor, by the way. I'm just a simple student. But thanks for having me. I'm Werner Schouten, as was said. I'm a student at the doing global business and sustainability at the RSM. Other than that, I'm the chair of the Youth Climate Movement, and I'm also part of the advisory board of the societal advisory board of the Association for the Chemical Industry, also advising them a bit on sustainability. So I always say that I start the day and I end the day with climate in my head, and that is practically the case. And in the coming 5 minutes, I'll just shortly talk about my perspectives on civic leadership, and it's mostly perspectives from practice. And I look forward to how these perspectives will be complemented by Tine's more, I think, academic research perspective. So it'll be very interesting. When I say that I'm chair of the Youth Climate Movement, we represent over 100,000 youngsters, young professionals and students. We've become the #1 in the Trouw Sustainable 100. When I say that I'm chair of that, most people think about something like this. Students, youngsters protesting in The Hague or Amsterdam for better climate policies. And although this is very influential what they are doing, this is not us. But this is interesting because when I talk about what I do, people usually think of this more traditional way of looking at civic leadership and climate activism. It was traditionally dominated by campaigns and protests. Actually, people that decide to not play along in the game, but to bash the game in which climate policies are, for example, developed. And these actions are influential. I've talked with the Minister of Economic Affairs and Climate, and when he saw like 40,000 youngsters standing in Amsterdam for the climate, he also rubbed behind his ears whether or not to maybe develop some more ambitious policies. But, and that is, I think, the core of what I want to say, is that in order for it to be stronger, it needs to be complemented. And that is also part of the philosophy of our leadership at the Youth Climate Movement. That's the idea that those actions are very valuable, but to influence actually policies, you also need to be at the place where policies are developed. So as a Youth Climate Movement, we complement those actions with, for example, much less interesting actions like these, like talking with the Prime Minister about a green recovery, talking, for example, last week with the informateur of the new cabinet on the recovery plan and the governmental agreement that they will develop, and about sustainability in that. So we organize to actually talk along with, for example, the climate agreement, or with our policies on circular economy. We talk with members of parliament, we talk with ministries. And this is much less appealing on the outset, but it is more influential, or at least influential as that it complements the more activistic things. And then you may wonder, like, why would you do this? Why is this impactful? And I think that the core of our impact is that we organize a generation that doesn't want to be organized. They waved goodbye to the labor unions. They don't even know what the inside of a church looks like anymore. Rarely anyone is really connected to religion, but we managed to connect them for a joint purpose. And we're building a sort of an emancipation movement of youngsters that creep into the boardrooms and the influential rooms. And that is necessary, because we need to have some sort of shortcut to influential positions. Because once my generation is really on the seat of the current influential people in companies and in governments, I think hell already broke loose in terms of climate change. So we need this group of transformational youngsters. And this connects to a much more broader trend, this new form of climate activism. Because it's not just protesting anymore. I'd call this like playing the game to change the game. And even this, what we are doing, is not enough. We don't see enough change from what we are doing. And that is why I'm so fascinated about the fact that we see now more and more action groups actually playing the game to change the game. To give you another example of this new form of civic leadership is Follow This. It's an activistic shareholder group. They started to buy shares from oil majors to move them in the right direction. They put on resolutions in the shareholder meetings to move companies like Shell, Total, Equinor, Chevron, ExxonMobil into a more sustainable direction. And even this week, they booked a lot of success with majorities of shareholders supporting Follow This resolutions that companies should adhere to the Paris Climate Agreement. They booked success at Chevron, at Phillips 66, at ConocoPhillips. And in this way, they successfully actually played the game to change the game. And I'd also like to present our own success with that. We, for example, ensured that there's a Council for Future that is judging investment decisions of our National Growth Fund. Our National Growth Fund is a fund of 20 billion euros, which will invest in large, for example, infrastructural projects to ensure wealth in the future. And in this way, we also try to play along with the game, but to also influence the game so that we change the principles on which the game is based. And we see that more and more organizations, this new form of activism gets traction. To give you some examples, I think, especially in this week, is tremendously relevant. We have had Agenda that actually started a court case against the state to at least reduce their carbon emissions by 25% in 2030. We had Fridays for Future, a youth group that started a court case against the German state and managed that Germany is now actually bringing forward its goal to be climate neutral to 2045. And most recently, of course, we've had the court case of Milieudefensie against Shell, which urges the organization to become to reduce its carbon emissions by 45%, not just a relative goal, but a netto absolute goal in 2030. So I think it is urgently needed, because we may happily, these forms of activism are really needed, because we may happily talk about the incremental progress that we managed to book within companies, etc. But fact of the matter is that our 1.5 degree carbon budget will be finished within the coming 10 years. So that is, I think, for me, I think one of the more inspirational things is play the game to change the game. The biggest gift that students and civic leaders can give these days is being unimpressed with incremental progress that we book and demand more. Civic leadership has become part of the current system to move more traditional systems in a different direction. We need young professionals, for example, to speak up in their own organizations. And only when they creep into the boardroom, into the supervisory boards and have a say, we can manage to get those transformational changes about. So I don't ask you to be optimistic about the future, because I don't see too many reasons for that. I don't ask you to have hope. I ask you to be courageous, to have the courage to stop nodding along with incremental progress that we're booking, and to demand transformational change like these new forms of civic leaders showed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture, for presentation. We have few questions in the chat, so I would like to go on with that. Damien asked, what are your thoughts on the work of Roger Cox's Revolution with Law? Good example is the recent win by Milieudefensie against Shell. Would you like to connect and answer?
Yeah, of course. Thanks a lot for the question. I do not know his exact work on the revolution justified, in all honesty, but I do think that he properly shows that human rights are tremendously powerful to actually, we now show actually that he helps us to show that actually many of our actions are not in line with many of our human rights, universal human rights that we uphold, and that we uphold very publicly, but apparently do not always come forward in the actual activities that we engage in. So I think that Roger Cox had made a major contribution in that. And I hope it works towards a great awakening of this. He managed to do that with the Agenda court case, and now, of course, with Milieudefensie. And I'm curious to see what the future holds.
Yes, really interesting. Thank you for your answer. We have another question. So what do you think needs funding from the NGF, non-governmental funding? So Would you like to, yes.
Yeah, so I find the principles on which national growth funds are based find already a bit problematic, because they focus on increasing the GDP. That was at least initially the main goal. And what was interesting, I've more comments on the growth fund in itself. Is first of all that the government doesn't then decide themselves what they want to focus on. They just wait for projects to come by and to invest in them. And then that, for example, doesn't allow you to make truly transformational changes. So in my opinion, you should set some moonshots for 2030, 2050. Let me give you an example. For example, steel without any emissions. It is possible. We see that now currently developing in Sweden as well. The current Tata Steel is on a course which is on carbon capture, for example. It is, in my opinion, like a losing course. So why don't you sort of transform that steel industry into a whole ecosystem there, which you can base on hydrogen your steel making? I find that a very proper project actually for becoming more sustainable. The same holds for a chemical industry. I think you should, with your national growth fund, invest in those core cases that you as a country want to be big in. And now I think we decide not to choose, and we let the market decide what kind of projects they come. So in my opinion, I think we could give much more directions on that, and we hope to at least inspire that a bit. But in all honesty, as a council for the future, we also have to act, of course, within some of those limitations. So I have mixed feelings about that.
Yes, of course. So the agenda is actually really important, and the plan of what and how to do with the solutions. Another question would be actually, you mentioned that you are complementing in other activities and talks. You talk about the different issues, you address them. So in your opinion, is this kind of influence actually key for the successful civic actions and movements?
Sorry, could you repeat the questions? I didn't really understand the start of it.
Okay, since you mentioned you are actually working and addressing different activities and talk issues and talk about them, you're addressing it by talk.
Yeah.
In your opinion, do you think that this is the key actually for the successful civic actions and movement? Key way to.
Yeah, so I think it's a mix. I think for sure, if you imagine that like more right parties, like it's important that we get those perspectives in as well, because if you start bashing from the outside, I think it's very important that that is complemented with voices from the inside and also with initiatives that show that those things are possible. And I think that Tine will actually show a lot on like those newer initiatives as well. So I think that a combination of activities is very important. And I think that is also the more traditional way, also the talking that we did. I think you can move specific organizations in a better direction in that regard. But we now see actually that like through court cases, things are even perhaps even more influential. So I think if we take better care of like see how power is organized, you might also find better ways to sort of well manage to get your message better across.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Well, another question would be actually, what are some of the barriers that civic engagement has and civic actions? You know, what are the borders and barriers you have to overcome?
I think one significant, at least especially for us, like we're part of an emancipation movement. It's that like we started 5 years ago and we are still not always seen as sort of a logical stakeholder in the discussion. Well, actually, when we're talking about these issues, it is mostly like the future of my supporters that we're working towards. So I think we have like a major stake in that, but I think it's key indeed to sort of get that emancipation movement going. We see that, for example, with youngsters in education. We had student protests in the 1970s, and now they have actually great unions and umbrella organizations that represent them on national level as well. And they're actually involved quite well in developing education policies. I foresee that, hopefully, in the future as well for climate policies. And I think we can develop that further with, for example, we call it the generation test, that with like newer big policy packages, we, for example, do a generation test to check whether it's still relevant to do that. To give you a very concrete example, we're now widening our highway around Utrecht, and the national park has to be made smaller for that. And that is a tremendous loss, because if you ask youngsters, they say, well, in all honesty, I don't need a car. I want to have mobility. But when that's fulfilled with a sharing car of public transport, I don't mind. And then what you then, and that means that you then don't need that many roads or highways anymore. And that's a bit sad that you still sort of, a lot of policies are still developed in a much traditional way of, okay, everyone wants to own their own, have their own car. And so we need more asphalt. So we need more space for that. Well, actually, if you look under the surface and see what youngsters demand, you can make significantly different policy choices. So in that regard, I think such a generation test could be of great additional value of like making policies also much more inclusive and much more future fit.
Okay, definitely. Thank you for this answer as well. We have time for one more question, and that would be actually when we take in regards all of this current situation at world, actually, with the pandemics and everything. Would you say that internet actually today is the most important and the best tool actually for the different civic leadership and civic movements, campaigns, and activism and influence as well?
Whether internet is the right tool for that?
Yes.
Yeah, I've also mixed feelings about that. I think it's good to sort of organize yourself. We started during the COVID crisis as an organization of digital natives that have brought up with these digital systems. It was very easy to continue to organize ourselves, and also with like party conferences talking about their political party programs, we could easily sort of attend all those events, for example. That was very convenient for us. So I think it is very convenient in some sense to organize people, but on the other hand, I think it also allows a lot of hatred, as we've seen as a response to the court cases that we have. So I think internet can be a great win, but it should be used in a proper way.
Yes, of course. I would like to thank you now for your lecture, actually, for giving us this presentation and speech. Unfortunately, we are now running out of time, but I would like to also mention once again for all of our participants that they can continue with the questions and with their comments on this session. Thank you once again, and I will now give actually chance to my companion Benoit.
Thank you very much, Werner. And of course, we are right now using the internet to have this session, of course. So it's a mixed bag for sure, but it also allows a lot of advantages. Right now, I would like to introduce Tine de Moor. She is Professor of Social Enterprise and Institutions for Collective Action at Rotterdam School of Management. Thank you very much for joining us, Tine.
Well, thank you for inviting me to the session. And first of all, I'd like to say that I feel very much honored to be part of this session with a wonderful example of courageous collective action, young courageous collective action with a great vision on how we have to use collective action in the future. And well, in the previous sessions, there seemed to be a sort of call for more collective action. So I guess those who are in this session are really in the right place now, because what I'm going to do is start by explaining a bit about another movement than the one that Werner has been talking about, but which actually is, well, not connected, but at the end of my talk, I'd like to give some food for thought on how those might be connected. I hope you can all see my slides, and I'm going to give some background information and in the end come to what I would like to call the civic leadership paradox and how we might find some ways out of it. So if we look at ways to sort of subdivide collective action and academic literature.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah?
We can see your slides, but they're not in full screen.
Okay, or maybe I should then, okay, yes, this is probably the way to do. Yes, is this better?
Yeah, this is perfect.
My fault. Okay, so we can go back to one of the great scholars in sociology, Charles Tilly, who actually made one big division between forms of collective action. On the one hand, contentious collective action, whereby you would think, well, of actions like the one Werner was talking about, whereby you work towards a specific goal, like specific measures to avert climate change, that want to start from a specific cause, try to attract as many people as possible. The more people, the better. And those people don't really have to identify themselves, apart from some leaders in the field, like Werner himself. So you can stay anonymous, and you don't have to be from a local place. You can actually be from anywhere. The more people that attend the climate change demonstration, the better, so to speak. So you can call that contentious collective action. On the other hand, you have a more institutionalized form of collective action, which is usually aiming at long-term goals for a whole group of people, but a delimited group of people. And they have to sort of self-identify to belong to that group because, well, the sort of collective action they set up works on a group basis, works on the basis of group norms, and they want to achieve some collective goals. And often these involve resources, such as, for example, energy. Last night I was part of a debate set up by Patagonia, who made a really interesting movie about energy cooperatives set up by citizens across Europe. Really interesting to watch, and you see the enormous power that's really available among citizens nowadays in Europe to set up, for example, collectivities, institutions for collective action, we call them, that are really aiming to develop ways to create new renewable energy. Now, the rest of my talk is going to be particular about this type of collectivities, citizen collectivities, you could call them, institutions for collective action, you could call them. And much of the scientific literature is actually going back to a very interesting work by Elinor Ostrom, who got the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009, as a non-economist, I should say. But she has been doing a lot of research on how these institutions for collective action research develop. And that's exactly also what we are looking at in a research group in the Rotterdam School of Management. Another term that's probably quite familiar to a lot of you is commons. That's a term that's often used to refer to this kind of institutionalized form of collective action. Now, when we look, for example, at the Netherlands, we see that over the past 15 years, more or less, we've seen a huge rise in the number of this kind of institutionalized forms of collective action, formed by citizens bottom up in often what we could refer to social enterprises. So enterprises set up primarily for specific goals that have not to do with profit making, but primarily with aiming for renewable energy, but also affordable care on a level for that really respects the human beings that are being cared for. But also in the middle, you see examples of new forms of agricultural co-ops being set up across the Netherlands, a very popular form of collective action these days. But we also see worldwide a new rise in mutuals, sort of mutual insurance schemes that are being developed by citizens for citizens. So often in a digital sense, but in the Netherlands, for example, there's lots of new forms that are called bread funds that provide insurance for people who are self-employed. And another type of, virtual collective action, you can say, is the development of platform cooperatives that are trying to bring back the rights of workers in, for example, core services like the ones we all know, Airbnb, Deliveroo, Uber, etc. But we also know there's a lot wrong with the way how people are treated as not employees, in fact, as workers in those platforms. And there's a whole new movement of platform cooperatives that really goes against this and tries to develop a cooperative alternative for these platforms. So a lot is going on out there in terms of new forms of collective action. The question remains, of course, what can these mean for system change? How are they going to influence the future? How are they going to contribute to these SDGs, for example? Well, there's a number of reasons why these forms of collective action might be an avenue that can help us to pursue these SDGs. For example, they might be able to actually finance new organizations, that new social enterprises, by forms of crowdfunding, but also they include the consumers themselves, as these are citizens collectivities set up by the citizens, primarily for these citizens who are members. They can actually contribute to a better consumer base that also guards the social and environmental goals of these collectivities in a much stronger way than if you do it, for example, with a normal shareholder company. Another way, another impact that might be available through these forms of cooperative enterprises is that they actually allow for a greater carrying capacity of innovative ideas. They, by citizens supporting other citizens to bring out new forms of institutions and new forms of innovations, as you often see in social enterprises, it might actually be possible to generate more, a greater base, a greater consumer base for such new innovative product. Furthermore, we're studying actually the possibility that being part of such a collectivity allows people to, stimulates people to think more about scarcity, to think more about the needs they have among each other, and in that sense also think more about how they can contribute to society outside of these collectivities. So one of the essential aspects of these new forms of collectivities is that they often at least try to work on democratic principles. And it might be the case that this also helps people to, well, think more democratically in a more solidary way outside of these collectivities as well. For example, engage in more political cause, etc. Now, this in particular, this issue, and scientists are still studying that, in fact, whether that's actually the case or not. This actually also is a bit of a problem, because when we look at these collectivities and how and why they are formed, we see that they actually have a bit of a leadership problem sometimes. So what happens when people come to the conclusion that they have to set up their own organization, their own institution for collective action, is that they come together, they decide to invest, for example, in a windmill, in an energy cooperative that runs this windmill. So they become investors, but they also become consumers, sometimes also employees of the people working for the cooperative. And sometimes they become part of a cooperative as producers. But they combine these roles. Now, they do this because then they create these collective resources. Usually, when you put a group of people together with a collectivity of resources, this creates a social dilemma. So you have to make rules, you have to set up norms that help your organization to develop, and that's when you build this type of institution. Now, the problem here is that people, well, they primarily use these collectivities for their own use. For example, people invest in an energy cooperative to make sure that they get their own renewable energy. They do so trying to take into account the limits of their own collective resources and the energy in this case. And they also try to do so by involving everybody, by trying to develop democratic values. But in many of these collectivities, there is a bit of a clash between democratic functioning and leadership. Of course, you do need leadership in these organizations, but how to achieve it in an organization that really puts democratic governance first. Sometimes there is a lack of leadership because also there's a lot of volunteering sometimes in these organizations. People do not always take up a leading role as a volunteer because they have their day jobs as well. In other situations whereby people are also employees of the cooperative, you see that this is maybe less of a problem, but we actually see very few work cooperatives so far. So we don't really get inspiration therefrom. It's sometimes also annoying to have strong leaders in these organizations, and because, as I just said, they try to function democratically, and they try to do so in a flat organization. So in many cases, we see a need for leadership, but also a lack of leadership in these organizations. So there's really a point, there's really an issue to work on in these organizations. And it is actually quite important that this happens because these institutions are growing rapidly. There's more and more energy cooperatives, care cooperatives, etc. And their impact can be substantial. We've seen that in Germany, for example, where many small energy communities, cooperatives run by local communities actually contributed greatly to the Energiewende. They really made a difference in putting renewable energy first. So they need to work on that issue in order to improve also their visibility towards others who have never heard of cooperatives or the possibility to invest in them. That could actually contribute a lot. They would be able to pull in those people to increase their impact. So one of the solutions to this is that there is a better bridge being built between the generations. The big difference between the type of collective action that Werner was just showing is that is actually the generation gap, so to speak. Most of the institutions I've been talking about are run by people who have settled, who have children, who want to start thinking about what kind of energy do I want, what kind of food do I want. But often we see very few young people in these types of institutions. So it's time, I think, to build more intergenerational collectivities whereby both younger people and, well, people of 30 plus, 40 plus who set up these collectivities work closer together. And I think there's also a lot to be learned by these collectivities from, for example, the Young Climate Movement. For example, their forms of leadership, their capacity to also connect to policymakers, is something that is really not well developed yet as such among these types of institutions for collective action. I'll keep it with that. After this session, there's actually still a possibility to visit the booth where some members of our research team will be present. And that's online somewhere.
Thank you very much, Tine, for this very extensive presentation. If both speakers are okay with it, we will just waive the call to action, and we'll just have a more open discussion for the remainder of the session, which would be around 10 minutes. I guess that's enough time to present Tine with some questions, and also ask you both to maybe conclude at the very end. A question for Tine from the chat is what do you think about how the Dutch government has translated the European Clean Energy Package in the Dutch context? I guess that's your question of the person in the chat. Yeah.
That's no doubt a very good question, but my knowledge about this type of policy is not great enough, I guess, to answer this question in a proper way. So I really need some more background information to understand. Of course, there's the whole development right now going on whereby citizens are going to be involved more intensively in setting up energy communities, but I'm not entirely sure if that is what you're actually talking about. Yeah, yes, I understand now what you're saying. Okay, that's partly the case. On the other hand, there's also, we had a discussion about that yesterday also with people from energy co-ops across Europe. There's also great pressure coming from large companies like Shell, who will now be looking for opportunities to very rapidly invest in carbon-free forms of energy production. So that's something these local cooperatives are very much aware of, that this is going to happen. It's actually already happening. It's something that we've seen also in other sectors, like the fiberglass sector, whereby first collectivities developed the whole infrastructure, and then there were commercial parties coming in and bought the whole thing, basically. Of course, but energy cooperatives don't necessarily have to give in into this. I think there's really absolutely a need, a very large need from the national government right now to support these cooperatives. We see, for example, in the Netherlands also that there's a lot of small energy cooperatives, really small ones with a lot of potential still to grow in terms of members. In other countries, for example, like Belgium, I live myself in Belgium, you see a few, not that many energy cooperatives, but they have a lot of members. So they're larger as individual organizations. And in a way, I think the Dutch situation is actually offers more room for growth of energy cooperatives still, because there's still plenty of opportunity, but they will need support, I think, in this. Mainly not so much support, but protection from the national government. I think that's a very vital issue in this decision, this point. I hope that answers the question more or less a bit for whoever that might be.
I think so, yeah. It was actually a question I also had, is that you could argue that corporations or collectives are at a disadvantage when they're going up against these big companies that have access to so much more capital, right? How do you see that? Do you think that the government should subsidize these corporations or collectives, or do you think the free market will figure it out, or do you think some kind of regulation is needed?
Well, I think it's actually important that they get the room to grow. But what is really, I think a lot can be done already with in the current situation with investments by citizens. There's actually quite a lot of willingness also by citizens to invest in this kind of connectivities, not just energy. We've seen huge developments, for example, in the buying of land of land recently with for organic farming, etc. So citizens are actually really willing to invest in this, but of course they still need to get the opportunity to, for example, set up windmill parks, etc. And in those cases, they are often indeed very much disadvantaged to even get an opportunity to get access to those places where you can still put windmills and other types of energy producing methods.
And would you say that the project that Denmark, for example, has done with the tax benefits, was that a good thing by the government to for individual families and individual civilians to like own a windmill? Do you think this is a route that we can take for more locally owned energy?
I don't know exactly what kind of tax benefits the Danish government gave. What I do know is that a lot of these collectivities are not asking for subsidies. Tax benefits, of course, something different. But it is quite striking how many of these collectivities actually really want to guard their independence, so that they don't have to also, well, they can basically set up their own rules. Tax benefits, yes, that could be interesting. That depends, I guess, also on the country and what kind of possibilities there are. Tax benefits are usually interesting for companies. That's also why a lot of them are in the Netherlands.
Well, it's not so important, but the Danish plan was that they actually gave tax breaks to the families who invested in the windmills. But it's not so important. One final question directed to you, Tine, is that when you talk about corporations, you have to talk about the Mondragon Foundation in Spain, of course, and they have had some things come out like that they are exploiting workers in the global south, I think, like Latin America. Where do you think that comes from? Because it is a collective, it is worker-owned, I think, for the most part. Do you think that's because they're trying to compete too much, or is it because, well, I'm asking the question to you, of course.
Yeah, actually, it's a good point, because I once was in a similar discussion with people from Mondragon about this. And the truth is that indeed, in the Basque Country, the companies they've set up there, they do function as a cooperative, but as soon as you look at their company, the companies they set up outside of Basque Country, they're not run as a cooperative. They're obviously not saints themselves either. But I think it's a missed opportunity and a bit sad as well, that if you set up a company outside and specific norms and values that you honor so much and that are extremely important also, well, in terms of marketing even, are all of a sudden not that important anymore. So the reasons for that is, I'm not sure, how exactly the relationships are sort of like in supply chains, etc., towards Mondragon in Spain, but well, there's something like the cooperative values, so the ICA principles, and this does not fit with the ICA. Those are the International Cooperative Alliance principles, which also say something about a relationship with other cooperatives, and this simply does not fit. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it takes a bit away from the credibility, of course, of the idea of.
Yeah, and to be honest, I mean, there's lots of. For example, in many African countries, there's a lot of. The cooperatives are not always taken serious, or people are not entirely sure they should join a cooperative, because there's often also a political side to it, etc. So this should be a nuanced story. It's interesting to see that so many new collectivities are being set up with people on the one hand to do this because they want this renewable energy in their own house, but they also want they do this because they demand more than simply a product. They want also values coming with their product. So that is an interesting development, but it's the cooperative. There's a cooperative history as well, and it's not cooperative principles have not been applied all over the world in the same way always. So we have to be nuanced about this too. As with any other company, with any other organizations, things go wrong as well. And yeah, that's what's happened.
Thank you very much for your answers. Unfortunately, we are at the very end. I saw that there was one question that was addressed to both speakers. So if you wouldn't mind, I would first ask Werner to maybe give us the answer, and then to conclude what you take away from this session. And then, like in the previous session, we give the professor the last word to end this session. So Amaranta asked, what would you like to share with the youth that lives in the global south and that very often don't have the tools available like people in the global north to create these disruptions and amplify their movements, their own movements? They are often, and of course these societies are on the forefront of climate change, on the forefront of, if things keep getting worse with the environment, they will be the first people affected, of course. What would you say to the people living in those countries, Werner? Yeah.
So I think I would say to them exactly what I just said at the end of my, is like, be courageous, because I not only say things to them, we actually work together with them. We together, and I'm sometimes critical about the Dutch government, but in this area they are leading, because together with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we've launched We Are Tomorrow Global Partnership, through which we work with organizations from those areas. So like from third world countries like Nigeria that are suffering from climate change the first. And we do that in a way because, like, the Dutch democracy is rather open. Like the fact that I can just have a talk with the Prime Minister or have a talk with the Minister of Climate every half a year is exceptional as when you compare that to those countries. So what we do is that we collaborate with those regional movements, because don't forget there are movements there that also step up, but they don't always have the resources. So what we do, we connect them to the Dutch embassies there, and then the Dutch embassies, which have contact with policymakers, bring those into contact with those policymakers. And with that, we have already managed that the youngsters are working together with them on policy plans. They're coming along to the Conference of Parties in Glasgow coming time. So we don't only try to say like hopeful words to them, we also try to help them and use sort of also a bit of the ideas that we have in the Netherlands on collaborating with governments through the embassy to actually connect them with policymakers. So I think that is what we try to do, and we do now do that in 10 countries, and we hope to do that in many more countries soon.
Very much for that answer, and thank you very much for your time as well. And Tine, I will give you the last word.
Yeah, the irony of institutions for collective action, of commons, if you want, is that, in fact, so I've just described this whole new movement, well, it's been going on for a while in Europe, but in many countries in the global south, these commons are still there, and they're still being used. They're still, in agriculture, for example, there's still many irrigation commons. There's still many people working in agricultural commons. So, and often they have been using these kinds of systems, these forms of collective action for centuries as well. We have, in the 19th and 20th century in Europe, abolished the types of commons we had in Europe. We also had a history, but we've abolished them at some point in the 19th and 20th century. But in the global south, there's still a lot of these examples. And it's a bit ironic that in the West, we now claim to have a lot of people engaged in this movement, think they have found a new way of working together, of coming up with cooperative ways of dealing with resources, etc. Whereas in the global south, this has, in many cases, never, it's still there. It hasn't gone away, so to speak. So I would also plea for not just exporting Western ideas to the global south, but also having an eye for the opposite, for looking what kind of finding inspiration in the global south, about how to work together, how to set up this kind of institution to, and you know, there's often little discussion about what it really takes to set up these institutions, but when it comes to actually running them, it turns out to be quite difficult sometimes. And in many cases, there is, in many global South countries, there's a lot of examples. There's a lot of experience still there. We can also use in the West to improve our own functioning, so to speak.
Okay, thank you so much to both of our professors. I'm afraid now that we're running out of time of the breakout session number 3. And I would like to really thank to our speakers today, Tine and Werner, and for their actually really interesting and different, let's say, aspects of civil progress and leadership and the challenges that we are all facing as some part of this society. I would like to thank also to my colleague and to all of you participants who were with us today at this session. Thank you so much, and we hope that you enjoyed this summit.
Thank you very much. And don't forget, after this, there is an expo where I don't know if Young Climate Movement is there. No, unfortunately. But PeaceJam is there, and the Research Institute is there as well, that Tine is part of. So feel free to check those out. Thank you very much to our speakers, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks so much.
You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.